Paradise, Texas is a rural community defined by cattle country and a baseline expectation of safety. It is the kind of town where doors are left unlocked and children play freely in their front yards. These you-can-be-anything Barbie dolls were meant to be a Christmas gift. On the afternoon of November 30th, 2022, a subcontracted delivery driver dropped a box containing this exact set onto a driveway in Paradise for a 7-year-old girl named Athena Strand. Within minutes of that routine delivery, Athena vanished from her own property. Her disappearance triggered a massive response. Over the next 48 hours, hundreds of community volunteers, local deputies, and helicopters scoured the dense Texas brush for any physical sign of where she had gone. Investigators looked beyond the physical landscape, pulling the digital tethers broadcasting from the delivery vehicle that had just left the Strand home. Securing justice required unraveling a web of gig economy data and stripping away the shifting psychological alibis of a predator. Investigators pulled the telematics and phone geofencing data associated with the FedEx delivery route. The coordinates pinpointed the driver, Tanner Lynn Horner, exactly at the crime scene during the narrow window of the child's disappearance. Upon his arrest, Horner claimed he struck the child with his van, panicked, and killed her to hide the evidence of a traffic accident. Law enforcement bypassed his written statement and extracted the hard drive from the interior video and audio security systems installed inside his delivery truck. The interior camera captured Horner lifting Athena into the vehicle. A still frame shows her sitting upright behind the driver's seat, unhurt. The recording proved his claim of a traffic accident was false. Horner eventually covered the camera lens, but the microphone remained active. The system recorded over an hour of audio, capturing Horner issuing sexual commands, followed by a physical struggle and the child's pleas for her mother. The data revealed a calculated predator who utilized his assigned logistics route as a hunting ground. Confronted with the digital evidence, Horner pivoted. He attempted a psychological defense, claiming the murder was the work of a dissociative alter ego he called Zero. He utilized this persona to stall, providing authorities with multiple false locations for the victim's remains. The lead Texas Ranger chose to humor the delusion, interviewing the Zero persona directly. By engaging with the psychological defense, the Ranger bypassed Horner's resistance and extracted the exact coordinates of the body. Athena's remains were recovered from this waterway near Boyd, located approximately 9 miles from her home. Law enforcement weaponized the killer's own psychological manipulation against him, securing the physical evidence necessary for a capital murder indictment. It took over 3 years of venue changes and forensic DNA backlogs to bring the case to the historic Tarrant County Courthouse in Fort Worth. On April 7th, Horner pleaded guilty to capital murder and aggravated kidnapping before jury selection concluded. This guilty plea converted the proceedings into a pure sentencing trial, shifting the legal focus to his mental state and moral culpability. Defense argued his autism and childhood issues should spare him the death penalty. Prosecutors countered with witnesses alleging sexual assaults from 2013, establishing a predatory pattern. To prove future dangerousness, they played the van's audio, revealing Horner sang a Christmas carol immediately after the murder. The evidence established that Horner acted by choice, a remorseless threat to society. After deliberating for less than 3 hours, the jury sentenced Tanner Horner to death. While the criminal trial concluded, the case exposed a systemic flaw, the gig economy corporate loophole. Major logistics corporations utilize third-party subcontractors to handle residential deliveries. This structure insulates the parent company from direct employment liability and operational oversight. This fragmented vetting structure allowed an individual with a history of undetected predatory behavior to gain sanctioned, unsupervised access to residential doorsteps. Thousands across Texas wore pink to honor Athena. At the same time, her family moved forward with civil suits aimed at forcing corporate accountability and closing the subcontractor loophole. At the sentencing hearing, Athena's uncle told the court that the killer will be forgotten as a mere footnote in her story. The ultimate focus remains on a young life cut short. On April 7, 2026, as jury selection concluded for a capital murder trial, the defendant did the one thing nobody expected. He pleaded guilty. With that single plea, the trial for the murder of 7-year-old Athena Strand bypassed the questions of who committed the crime and what happened. Instead, the proceedings inside the Tarrant County Courthouse shifted entirely to the punishment phase. This left the jury with a deeply unsettling task. They didn't have to solve a mystery. They had to evaluate the killer's mind and decide between two radically different interpretations of his intent. The defense argued that the violence was a catastrophic panic reaction. They presented a psychological profile of a broken mind, citing severe autism, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and childhood lead poisoning as the true drivers of his actions. The prosecution painted a different picture. They argued these diagnoses were merely a shield for a predator, exploiting the anonymity of his delivery route. Under Texas capital sentencing law, the difference between a life sentence and the death penalty rested entirely on this debate. The jury had to decide if they were looking at a hopelessly broken individual or a coldly calculating killer. When investigators first brought Tanner Horner in for questioning, he offered a specific sequence of events. He claimed he accidentally backed his delivery van into Athena in her driveway, panicked, and abducted her to cover up the mistake. The defense anchored this story in catastrophizing. For a neurodivergent mind, a minor stressor triggers an irrational, escalating panic response, overriding logical thought. But objective data severed that narrative. Internal van camera footage proved that when placed inside the vehicle, she was entirely uninjured. The evidence proved the accident story was a constructed lie, designed to mask a deliberate crime of opportunity. Once inside the van, the driver took a specific physical action. He covered the internal camera lens. However, the microphone remained active, capturing over an hour of audio between him and the child. Defense attorneys characterized the chaotic recording as evidence of a massive sensory overload meltdown. They argued it captured a man completely devoid of impulse control or rational thought. Prosecutors pointed to the driver's words. He methodically questioned her age, commanded her not to scream, and demanded she remove her clothing. The prosecution argued that the deliberate physical act of covering the camera lens before any violence occurred demonstrates acute, real-time awareness of his actions and a clear consciousness of guilt. That audio recording legally reframed the entire event. It dismantled the theory of a spontaneous, panicked reaction, exposing instead a prolonged, sexually motivated predation. This pattern of calculation continued into the interrogation room. The defendant provided investigators with false locations for the body, attempted to negotiate a release for Christmas with his son, and eventually blamed the murder on an alter ego he called Zero. These deliberate misdirections cost valuable time, forcing hundreds of volunteers and law enforcement officers into an exhausting rural search operation based entirely on his lies. The defense maintained that the Zero persona was genuine, a severe dissociative break from a brain incapable of processing its own horrific actions. Prosecutors dismantled this claim by introducing testimony from 3 separate victims who detailed sexual assaults committed by the defendant nearly a decade earlier, proving the Zero persona was a calculated manipulation tactic. This established history of violence proved he possessed long-standing predatory intent. It undermined any argument that the murder of Athena Strand was the result of a sudden, isolated psychological break. During deliberations, the jury faced a rigid threshold under Texas capital sentencing law. They had to weigh whether the medically documented neurodevelopmental diagnoses were sufficient to legally excuse the calculated intent shown in the evidence. It took the jury less than 3 hours to entirely reject the defense's mitigation narrative. They determined he remained a continuing threat to society and formally sentenced him to death. The jury's decision was a stark reminder of a legal reality. Even severe neurological impairment does not, by itself, negate the capacity for calculated predatory violence. Ultimately, the community chose to shift its focus away from the killer and onto the victim. Across Texas, schools and towns participated in a massive Pink Out movement, a collective effort to ensure Athena Strand's name and memory outlive the man who took her life. The outcome centered the trial on the evidence of intent, prioritizing the cold mechanics of a premeditated crime